We're here today to talk about eSkimming and client-side attacks. Give you a little bit of a briefing around what you might expect to see as we get into the holiday season. A lot of this is informed, or actually all of it is informed by the threat research that we do here at Source Defense. We've got a team of folks that are always out there looking at what's going on. That information, helps to, sort of better shed light on the problem, and it constantly informs the progression and advancement of our technology. We are the pioneer in this e-skimming security space. Been doing this for the better part of the last 9 years, and so we've got I think, a unique perch in terms of our visibility into the issue and into the problems. We'll give you a little bit of a threat briefing, talking about what you can expect to see, the types of evolution that we've seen in recent attacks. Probably, I think we're focused this over the course of the last 2 months. Talk a little bit about emerging trends, some real world attack case studies, and then talk a little bit about what you need to do to protect yourselves, with a little bit of an insight into some issues that we see in the guidance provided under the DSS. And some things you need to do, I think, to be thinking about how to solve this problem, with the most security forward approach possible. So we're leading into, it's very hard to believe that we're already back to this time frame in this year, but we're leading here in Q4 into the holiday season. For those of you guys that are merchants on this call, I'm sure this is about to be sort of like that stress season for you as we get close to Black Friday and into the holiday shopping season. You can expect a lot of threat activity to kick up in this time frame. It really is not your busy time period only. It is cybercrime's sort of heyday period. They love to hit during this time frame when peak traffic and peak opportunity kind of exist. We're looking in most instances for 3 to 4 times the normal traffic volume to your e-commerce sites. It's great cover for their malicious activity. A lot of noise, within legitimate transactions that they can hide within. And they love to hide within, legitimate transactions. It's a core sort of part of their trade craft, especially in this e-skimming world. And so, it's the right time for you guys to be, trying to do something about the problem. Now, I know that, many of the merchants that we work with, and we work with, more than 1,000 of the world's largest, and even more than that, in terms of our client base. You're going to go into a code freeze period leading into Black Friday. And so there's a couple of things that I would say, on that end of things. We're going to give you some advice in terms of things that you can do without deploying a solution like Source Defense. That'll be later in this deck. But that said, if you want to try and get something in place in advance of Black Friday, there is still plenty of time. Plenty of time. We can deploy our solution in as quickly as 24 hours. I'll explain how and why as we go along and get a little bit more insight into what we do. There is still time to protect yourselves. But again, like I said, we'll try and give you some advice, and then we can also offer you that sort of protective umbrella of Source Defense. It should also be noted that if you haven't done anything, you are non-compliant with PCI. If you do get hit, because the requirement was back as April 1st was the deadline for implementation of these controls. If you do get hit in this time period, you are exposed if you don't have a solution in place. So there's a lot of motivation to get moving, both to protect your consumers, protect your brand, and to keep yourselves, in PCI good graces, if you will. With all this peak traffic, with all this peak opportunity for the bad guy, payment pages basically become the highest value targets. You're going to see millions of transactions, sometimes on a daily basis. You've got, people staffed up. You got, rapid code deployments that you try to push, and lock down that environment. There's new vulnerabilities that may not have been fully, identified and tested. There's ways for, the bad guy to get in. And every marketing pixel, every analytics tag, every third-party script becomes a potential entry point for attackers to inject their malicious code. And it really is your digital supply chain, that they're going after. And so, yeah, it's a busy season, and it's going to be a busy one for the bad guys as well. To that last point on, sort of where the vulnerabilities are introduced into your site. Obviously, you're running first-party scripts, first-party JavaScript on your site, the stuff that you wrote, the code that you guys compiled. But the majority of, merchants out there are using, a vast network of third-party digital supply chain partners. Everything from Google Tag Manager and Analytics, and your Metapixel, your ad tech, all the various different things that are there. Social media connections, open source libraries that you're calling on, like what happened with that whole Polyfill IO stuff, like late last year. A lot of this stuff that's running in every single consumer transaction isn't yours. And the adversary knows that, and they attack these supply chain partners. And they know that writ large, the industry really doesn't have visibility and control over the scripts that are running on the site, and so they're taking advantage of that, and they're hitting things hard, right? Effectively, if you were to look at today's sort of like eSkimming kill chain, it takes advantage of, or the attack chain takes advantage of, a fundamental shift in web architecture. Everything's JavaScript. And while we've done a good job focusing on data in transit and data at rest, and we've hardened down our server infrastructure, and we've created network segmentation for our payment flows. The client side, the browser side, where the threat actually is executing, is largely unprotected. Malicious scripts can execute directly in customer browsers, invisible to your server-side monitoring, invisible to your network security tools. Every marketing tag, platform, payment integration, even creates dependencies on this external control you don't control, code you don't control. And they disguise their attacks as either as legitimate services or through these legitimate services, and also are delaying exfiltration, are using randomization, are using techniques that hide themselves in the noise to evade detection during your typical windows. So you've got a sophisticated threat landscape. You've got a lot of vulnerabilities out there. You've got a need to monitor the browser code, to secure these third parties, to treat everything with a zero trust kind of policy. But we really aren't constructing our approach to the problem that way. And so it really dawns on the community to solve the problem in a different way. We've got a behavioral based approach to the issue that really can control the threat and prevent these attacks from happening. And we'll talk a little bit about it as we go on. I want to talk about a few attacks that we've seen just in the last, call it 60 days, and that we've reported on through our research. First is, what we call like sort of a sneaky skimmer, where it's masquerading itself, as jQuery. And so in this case, you've got a sophisticated skimmer designed to look like a legitimate jQuery library file, basically exploiting your trust, in that framework. It starts first with, malicious code masquerading as this jQuery file. It bypasses content security policies and, allow lists, blacklist, whitelist, as a result. So it's looked to and masked as, a legitimate, library, and it's deceptively loaded in and bypassing some of the traditional controls that you might have in place, like CSP. It creates an overlay injection, fake input fields, invisibly overlay real PCI compliant payment forms. In many cases, what we're seeing, and in this particular case, the attack actually validates the payment card on the client side before exfiltration. So minimizing the noise, maximizing the value of stolen credentials. Not in this particular case, but we've seen it in others. We've actually seen the use of the API back to the payment service provider to drive that validation. So we've seen an attack where they mimic a Stripe. What am I looking for? I'm at a loss for the words for the first time. Yeah, a Stripe payment page, right? iframe. There it is. Sorry. Where they mimic a Stripe iframe, they actually use the Stripe API to check and validate the card before they bother stealing it. On the exfil side of things, in this particular case, they've got WebSocket connections that transmit the stolen card data to a rotating command and control, domains. So they make sure that in the exfiltration of the data, that they're not sending everything to one known, infrastructure location. They're actually using, a sort of round robin, command and control infrastructure, so that should you detect, anomalous traffic to one, they still can continue the exfiltration to the multiples that they've set up. This is one case that we saw. I believe this one was as early as like 2 weeks ago. So we're starting to see this type of attack pattern, taking place more often than not. At one point, I wanted to make previously when I was talking about, the uptick in targeting of the payment page is, one area where we have a problem with what the DSS, states and guides you with, the PCI DSS 4.0.1, is this sort of over-reliant focus solely on the payment page itself as the attack surface. That's just not the case. The adversary is often compromising script that runs upstream in the website and are using techniques to put fake checkout flows in place, to drop form fields in that, or forms or form fields that should not have existed. It's a site-wide kind of vulnerability that leads to a payment page or a payment flow type of compromise. And so I want to make sure that that's something that sticks with you as well, because we see that a lot, where, hey, I'm PCI compliant because I've isolated down the scripts on the payment page, but I've left open and I'm not controlling the entirety of the website. And I'm still, even though I'm quote unquote compliant, susceptible to and have fallen victim to those types of attacks. We have seen more of an APT style skimmer, designed as Google Analytics. And this is a crazy one, because what you've got is effectively trying to take advantage of the trust that we all have, in Google as a brand, to hide themselves, and to actually, in another case, actually utilize a compromise in Google Analytics, to drive things forward. We're seeing Google Tag Manager as well. I'll talk about that use case here in a minute. But Google Tag Manager used as an attack vector as well. So, but in this case, effectively they weaponized Google Analytics to establish long-term presence on the victim pages, the checkout pages in this case. And that's what we see in a lot of cases, by the way. It's that APT style slow and low, that sort of like colonization of the site, if you will, or colonization of the web infrastructure, where they're fine not doing a smash and grab, and they're fine, just skimming. I mean, it's the nature of what we talk about with eSkimming, just skimming a little bit off the top, stay hidden, staying slow and low, hiding themselves in the noise, masking themselves to look like, something very legitimate, or compromising something very legitimate in many cases, so that they can stay in place for 6 months, a year. In the early phases of, eSkimming and MageCart, the average compromise was about 18 months. I think we're still in that case, because there are so many merchants who still have not adopted controls, still leaving the site open, and just haven't gotten around to it, where we're probably seeing way more persistence and way more attacks than we know about, simply because we don't have the monitoring visibility and the protection and the preventative and detection capabilities in place. But in this case, what they used was sort of a three-phased process, right? Starting with a two-page dynamic loader, right, or two-stage dynamic loader. The initial payload looked like legitimate Google Analytics tracking code. Once downloaded, the secondary malware was downloaded based on site configuration, and so there's a bit of adaptability, built into what they're doing, and obviously, some sophistication in terms of how they deliver the attack. Command and control channels are in place with real-time communication, allowing attackers to update tactics, without having to reinfect, and also, in a way, to adopt that sort of like APT cat and mouse that happens in a lot of cases where they built in anti-remediative steps, right? They can change what's going on based upon the changes you make in response to the first identification of them being there. Here's another one where, you've got fake payment forms. In this particular, excuse me, in this particular case, only deployed when triggered remotely, minimizing detection risk during any security audits. So it's on-demand form injection that happens, when they know that they can do so. And back to that sort of like silent skim kind of way that these things happen, do so with the least amount of possibility of being detection. So here's an example, brands that we trust, what would have been whitelisted, something that would have been, sort of like part of our trusted network, the masking it to look like Google Analytics. You got continuous payload updates to adapt to changes, to adapt to script updates, and even adapt to seasonal modifications that you might make. And in this case, the malware is morphing faster than security teams can respond. And so, detecting or utilizing signatures, is really not, a way to address the issue. There's also other attacks that are out and happening right now where there's a bit of social engineering that gets involved. In this particular case, we call it sort of like the pickpocket trick with a fake verification code. It's a multi-stage attack where you're weaponizing user trust in security measures like 2FA, and basically turning that trust into an accomplice in the theft. So in this particular attack, you see a multi-stage loader replacing the legitimate payment flow with basically a pixel perfect counterfeit. And I mentioned that previously, that we've seen and we continue to see a number of attacks where, they're literally mirror imaging, the payment page, very familiar, sort of like peace of mind inducing to the consumer, right? This is Stripe, or this is, the PayPal checkout process, right? Or, whatever form of a sort of transaction that they're used to. The bad guys are effectively like, completely mirroring that so that there's no consumer side detection. In this particular case, there was a fake 2FA prompt that kicked in, appearing, which asked for like additional security information. And then they engaged the victim, by manipulating them into thinking they're conducting a legitimate 2FA process. The extended interaction actually, helps to mask the theft that's in progress, preventing like immediate fraud detection. And we see that in a lot of cases. The bad guys are trying to do more and more, to ensure that the consumer doesn't see a different experience, or that if they do, it appears legitimate, or it appears like a page load issue, it appears like a refresh issue, those types of things, because they don't want the flag from the consumer to reach the merchant, right? Well, obviously we go through the, issuing bank first or whatever, but they don't want the merchant to catch on by being flagged by consumers that something is wrong with their checkout process. And so, we see that a lot, and that's one that's, kind of there. We've also seen Google Tag Manager, be used as a perfect camouflage. So in this particular attack, a fake GTM loader, Google Tag Manager loader, has been employed, and it's exploiting that trust to bypass even sophisticated blacklist, whitelist types of controls. In this case, you got an encoded payload. You've got, again, the use of multiple domains, in this case, dynamic domains. And in this case, we saw first-party exploitation, as opposed to third-party, attack vectors, right? And so, the first party is still even less so in these eSkimming attacks, but still, in some cases, that first party code is still attacked, or that server side of the equation, still falls under attack. And so, anything JavaScript, anything, related to, the client side delivery, of your web experience, you should really be on top of and focused on to try and get after these types of attacks. In this case, there was a skimmer embedded. It used, obfuscation techniques appearing as benign configuration data. The command and control infrastructure is basically rotating on an hourly basis, which kind of renders the block list side of things ineffective, because before you can identify something as a malicious domain and block it, they've already moved on and they've rotated to other infrastructure for command and control. And so, it's a similar technique to the one I think I described earlier, where it's sort of like the bad guys are building in persistence, and they're building in an ability to sort of like overcome what they know about the way we as security professionals, go about trying to ferret them out and get them off of our infrastructure. Okay. Um, there is within trusted infrastructure, a lot of too much trust. And we've done a tremendous amount of work as security professionals to focus on zero trust. And we've looked at, the supply side equation in risk management. And we've looked at, trying to drive down third party risk. But for whatever reason, we focused most of that attention not on, the e-commerce environment. And, I think there's a real problem there, because, I absolutely need to treat the e-commerce environment as, the most, if, one of the most, if not the most important, sides to our business from a security perspective. There have been multiple cases where, malicious code is injected directly into product bundles, and then use your legitimate CDN traffic patterns to exfiltrate data to keep it so that, again, they're slow and low and not being detected. In this particular case, there was a skimmer embedded in build processes, or compromised pipelines. We've seen in the case of Polyfill IO that I mentioned, I don't know, a handful of slides ago. That was like some point of, want to say, middle of last year. A trust in open source libraries being compromised, and even a trust in CDN in that case being compromised as well. Polyfill IO, Polyfill itself is a service that was designed as open source to help websites render in old browsers. Polyfill IO was, an infrastructure that was taken over by a Chinese threat actor, but you had thousands upon thousands of websites referring back to that location, and effectively loading, compromised script, right? Because no one caught on to the fact that the bad guys on the crime end of things had taken over, the CDN infrastructure. So you see that, in a lot of cases. Um, it demonstrates why there's an over reliance on CSP and SRI, as sort of security oriented approaches to the problem. Uh, I'll explain a little bit more as we get along, but it is one major issue. I've said this a couple of times now, that we have with the way the DSS, is constructed, because it's creating a false sense of security, and it's giving over the impression that with the CSP in place or utilizing SRI, somehow we're able to control the environment. Again, full stop. It's the trusted infrastructure that's being utilized. It's masking, and hiding the attacks inside, the areas that we trust. Here's another example. Yeah, this has led to the compromise of 35 websites across Europe, some fairly large ones, involved in that. And what you had was an attacker compromising a widely used developer library shared across these e-commerce platforms. They, had a package that was used in, dozens of retail checkout implementations. So everybody's calling into this shared library. They masquerade as a customer support tool, getting persistence on the page. And the data exfiltrate is happening after checkout completion when the security monitoring typically relaxes, and then stolen credentials or even cache in browser storage, avoiding immediate network detection. So a couple of those pieces, one thing that's unique there. The one-to-many side of things is not really all that unique. In fact, that we see that more and more in the early phases of e-skimming attacks. It was hit the big brands, or at least there were big brands, that were hit. Big, massive global, multinationals, massive global airline, as one example. What we've seen over the years is a one-to-many type of approach with the adversary. And so they do look for these ways where they can compromise multiple merchants or multiple e-commerce sites simultaneously by figuring out, where those shared resources come from. I mentioned the multiple thousands of websites on Polyfill.io. This is an example at a much smaller scale, but where, this trust and reliance, on these services can get them on multiple sites, at once, and gives them the opportunity to really kind of, increase, the ill-gotten gains there, right? The exfiltration after checkout, in a lot of cases, things will happen inline, but we're seeing more and more of this, advancement in the way that the adversary acts. Again, for the persistence, for the anti-detection, side of things. They're just staging the attack differently. They're staging the exfiltration in such a way, that sort of just, if we aren't keeping track with the novel approach, makes it harder and harder for us to detect, at least with traditional tools. One other thing that we've seen is this notion of localization deception. They are culturally adapting their attacks. And what do I mean by that? This particular campaign, highly sophisticated, basically adjusting its tactics based on website language, based on regional payment preferences, and even checkout terminology. So on the linguistic adaptation side of things, it looks for terms like checkout or payment, or I don't speak these languages, but Zalung, Pentar, right? I butchered those, so I apologize if those are your native tongues. But then generates matching fake forms. So, the scraping side, or the sort of the adversarial detection, is to, be able to see, the payment page and the payment process, regardless of what language it might be in. Back to that notion of, mimicry, and, picture perfect replicas. In this particular case, they're using specific payment gateways that are regional, like PayPal, Molly, Stripe, even local bank transfers, and, are smart enough to have their tactics, mapped to those localized norms and those regional norms. They're adapting fraud tactics by geography, exploiting patterns that exist dependent upon whether or not you're Europe and Asia or North America. This creates a real problem if you guys are multi-nation, or global, or are using, strategies to sell in multiple geographies. You're managing multilingual sites. It exploits like how complex it really is, where security teams, you may be in the States, but you're managing a broader, international infrastructure. You may not have full visibility and understanding into non-English, checkout flows. You may be doing some translation services and some localization. That layer makes that detection capability even harder. And, there's different attack signatures that they're using based upon what region that they're operating in. So they could hit you as one merchant across multiple domains, using, similar tactics, but modified specific to the localized, site that they're on. It creates a lot of problems, in terms of, us being able to sort of spot them at the early side of the equation. And so there's a few examples that I wanted to provide. There's more, way more of that, inside the threat research that we conduct. We've got a bunch of blogs that we put out on our threat research. We try and keep that up to date. We're going to do a better job, I think, sort of crystallizing all of that in the near term into sort of some roll-up reports and some summary reports for you. And so, there's a reason to stick around and listen to us. We can keep you educated on all this, as we go along, and as we sort of package up this research differently. I want to transition the conversation now really around, so what do we do about it, right? So there's some examples of where, we're seeing advancements in the attack side of things. We're seeing the adversaries, constantly getting smarter. They are listening, by the way, to our conversations. They are responsive to what's been done, in response to the DSS. And, they're not idiots, right? They're actually quite brilliant people. They just happen to be pretty scummy. So we've got to make sure we understand what they're doing, why certain things that we think we can rely upon can't work, and what we should do about it. And so, here's where I'm going to sort of like get up on a soapbox a little bit and say, you know, we cannot rely on sort of legacy approaches to this problem as we are dealing with an ever evolving threat landscape. Um, the approaches that we might have used, or even that the DSS call out, are not, security anymore. They create a false sense of security. They may get you a checkbox on the compliance end of things. But the bad guys, are a step ahead, and we need to recognize that and move appropriately. CSP and SRI, only provide static control over which scripts can load or can't. They don't allow for monitoring of the runtime behavior. If a whitelisted script executes, it executes. It's a fail open, kind of scenario. They're blind to malicious actions that are actually used every single day by the bad guy. So if I compromise one of your third party scripts, it's trusted. You've allowed it to run in your CSP, and that's just that. And so, it's a problem, when we look to these things and say, well, I'll just build out a policy and I'll just manage it and I should be good. Again, I mentioned like this notion of only trusting or only focusing on, the payment page itself as well. Again, like we've got to think site wide and recognize that the entirety of the website is a problem. The sort of allow lists are blind, CSP, SRI, these WebSocket connections, these dynamic fetch calls, the exfil via legitimate, endpoints, are going to bypass those types of controls. So, they can use trusted domains. They can use domains that weren't, previously identified as malicious, et cetera, et cetera. And so, I want to talk a little bit about, the difference between compliance and security as it relates to, the eSkimming problem. And so, what's an eSkimming compliance solution? Well, if you read the DSS as it's currently written, and you go down and you look at requirements 643 and you look at requirements 1161, these are the ones that deal with the eSkimming problem. You're going to see a lot of reference to controls that help meet the elements of these requirements to CSP and SRI. So, it's not the only things that they call out, but it's the first things that they call out. And, it's our position that they should just be completely removed from the DSS, because what is most, human tendency? It says, oh, well, like I've read the DSS. It says we can solve this problem with the CSP or SRI. Well, I've got CSP in place. I probably haven't done anything with it. I'm not managing it very well, but it's there. Maybe I should just update that, and I've got the problem solved. And again, it's not going to address the actual threat. It won't address the threat from the integrity control side of things. It won't address the threat from the alerting side of things. It's definitely not going to address the threat as it relates to identification of script changes. It's not going to address the threat as it relates to indication of compromise. You're just not going to see, the attack if you're reliant upon those types of controls, right? So, I can get a big compliance check on this thing with my QSA if I tell them I've got CSP or SRI in place, but I'm not going to stop an e-skimming attack from happening. And here's just a little quick look why, right? So when I implement CSP, right, I've got my web server, I've got, the third party tool, I've got my unassuming consumer in the middle, right? I'm looking at, the various different tools that are out there, and I'm saying, okay, cool. Well, these are the 10 that I want to standardize on. And in most cases, there's like 18 to 24 different third-party scripts that are being called into, any web environment. Yours is probably no different, maybe even more at this point in time. But you're going to create a list and you're going to say, well, these are my trusted connections. And I'm going to allow, resources, from those connections to be stored on my web server. And then I'm going to serve up that list of approved locations inside the visitor's browser. Well, if it's compromised or if it's, hidden inside what looks like legitimate flows, you're just blind to the attack entirely, right? The browser will load resources from locations defined as safe, via that policy. It will block other content from any other location, right? But that is not the attack vector that we need to worry about. So when we talk about, how to actually do more than just compliance, how to do security and actually stop the threat, right? I kind of wanted to break it down into, what you need to do and then the right way to do it. Now, first, just kind of look at like what you've got to do. Um, you know, these security gaps, eSkimming in particular, is specifically called out in those, standards that I mentioned, 643.11.6.1. You got to know what's on the site. You have to authorize that these scripts need to be there. You have to change, you have to monitor for any changes. You have to spot malicious activity as it occurs. You have to have either a rapid response plan in place, from a detection perspective, or you need to just block the attack outright. You've got to do some weekly integrity checks. You've got to be looking at your HTTPS headers. You've got to see, things that are happening as they happen. And so, you can take some steps without, a tool in place. And this is where I was going to get to some of the advice, right? If you're not going to have a solution in place that you can put over top of these scripts and management, you better be looking at these things, on minimum on a weekly, basis and, conducting integrity checks against these scripts. You need to have some way to identify real-time changes and alert your team to real-time changes. It's very complex to do so, without a solution like source defense in place, because in the case of, one of our clients where they've got dozens of web properties, they've got, hundreds of partners, and dynamic scripting is creating multiple thousands of changes, that they would need to look into, but it's possible. It's just not very feasible, that you build some kind of, detection, and alerting, on the internal end of things that helps you overcome some of that. Definitely make sure you're working with third-party vendors that, focus on PCI compliance, but don't just trust that to be the last mile. You've got to do, vendor assessments and dig in. Ultimately, what we would say is you really want to proactively deal with this. You need to get some kind of behavior-based solution in place. Um, you know, every day counts as you're hitting them towards Black Friday. I mentioned at the onset there, we can help you with a solution, overnight. And so, if you still have time before, code freeze goes into place, let's get moving. We can give you an overnight website assessment. We can get you, an immediate, rollout plan, in 30 days or less. Again, multiple clients of ours can do it as quick. We'll move as fast as you can. But if barring that, if you have no solution in place and you're simply, relying on, what you have, start right now by reviewing every JavaScript file, tag, and pixel on your payment pages. Document the owners, the purposes, what the data access permissions are. If you don't have to have something in there, get it out before code freeze, kicks in, right? Minimize the attack surface as best as you can. Look at your first party bundles. Get in there and make sure that any of the build artifacts don't have any unexpected code in them. Think about the open source libraries that you're calling upon and that your team has relied upon. Do your threat research. Make sure that there's not, something that's been disclosed that you missed in the news cycles, and really clean up, that part of things. We really think you should have a behavioral based monitoring solution in place. That's us. And runtime blocking in place. That's us. But those first couple of things, are what you can do. If you just don't have a solution, you're not going to get a solution in place before time runs out. That said, the sort of like self aggrandizing and the plug for us. We are a behavioral based, defense solution for your site that manages, all of the third parties and the first party script that you're running on your site that prevents the e-skimming, attack surface by by placing a behavioral control and a list of policies over top of all of these scripts. We take the script, we put it in, the scripts that are running there. We basically sandbox them so that they are not running in line to the consumer checkout process or the consumer, buying process. We allow the scripts to function as designed, but what we do is we control the behaviors of those scripts such that they can't access sensitive data like card data or PII, on your site. We come preloaded with an understanding of thousands of scripts that we work with on a day-to-day annual basis. What we do is we monitor for changes. We prevent the changes from happening, given that sandboxing approach. We store all the forensic data so you can see it, and we tell you what we stopped, but we do so without needing to build security operations processes around the response end of things. And so when we look at, the types of things that, I detailed out in some of that threat research, right? Every single one of the things that we saw, in those types of attacks, you can just rest assured won't impact you. Continuous monitoring from our end of things, behavioral controls from our end of things, to identify unexpected WebSocket connections that would trigger, an immediate stop or would be prevented in the first place. Any changes in code execution would be flagged but would be stopped, and any unauthorized transmission of form data to unknown domains would be blocked in real time. We, Source Defense, are really heavily engaged in the PCI community. We are a PCI PPO. It's a principal participating organization. We have a SAC-D compliant solution that we actually did an AOC with IBM on. So we are a PCI DSS compliant solution. We're also ISO 27001. We're on the PCI Board of Advisors. We're here to help. And we've been helping, the card brands. We've got multiple of the card brands as clients, as partners as well. We've been helping the merchant acquirer community. Some of the biggest names in the merchant acquirer community rely on us. We actually, protect 9 out of the top 11 gateways. We've worked with all the world's QSAs. They should know who we are. If you're using a QSA, they should know who we are. They can help you, sort of validate what we do. In fact, a lot of QSAs use our solution for their own assessments as they're coming into this rock period. We're trusted. We're here as a partner. We want this threat to go away, and we're the pioneer in the space. So you can talk to us for any number of different things. If you just want to get more of that threat research, steve@sourcedefense.com. Hit me up. Go to our website, right? If you want to assess your exposure. We can get you an overnight, analysis of how many scripts are running, where they're running, who they are, what they're doing, what types of visibility, the script has, into sensitive areas of your site. We're happy to do that. That's free of charge. You can just drop us a line. Yeah, I think Scott's probably putting it in the chat window, and we can get you a free assessment. As I mentioned, we can get you up and running on an implementation before Black Friday. So, that can happen if we start this week, it'll be done next week. Visibility control, compliance, security, all things that we can help you with, against this attack vector and against these threats. So we're here to help. Again, my name is Steve at sourcedefense.com. This is my email address. If you want to look at what's in scope, if you want to talk about building versus procuring, if you need us to come in and talk to your teams, and that could be web dev, security, GRC, e-com, we can come in and do all that. If you want us to sit down and, meet with your QSA and talk through what your environment looks like and talk through how we can, help secure it, we can do that. We've got a rapid action plan. And again, we can get things done for you overnight. So that's the end of my discussion. I see there's a bunch of stuff.